So this time next year, we're going to have our 10-year anniversary party. Yeah. Uh-oh.
We're gonna move. Do you want to
Yeah.
go to that kids?
Oh, yeah, we can do that. I could carry something. Oh, I think that's what it was. I think they're like building a sandcastle Oh, you got a little bit of water on the lens.
לפני כשנה וחצי טסתי לברלין לתערוכת הסופרבוס. היה משהו מרגש במיוחד בתערוכה הזאת, כי זו הייתה תערוכה של סינתסייזרים, וספציפית הסינתסייזרים המודולריים היורו-רק. אחת החברות המובילות בתחום היא חברת Make Noise, וכמו הרבה מהחברות האלה זו חברה שהוקמה על ידי בן אדם אחד, טוני רולנדו. מדהים לראות איך טוני רולנדו, שהוא יצרן של סינתסייזרים ומודולים, מתקבל בתערוכה הזאת כמעט כרוקסטאר. אנשים מבקשים ממנו חתימות, מבקשים להצטלם איתו.
Yeah, people are very passionate about modular synthesizers. So when they get the chance to meet the people that build them and design them, they're very excited about that. Many companies today they're very large. So when you go to think about who made your iPhone, for example, there's this huge team of really smart people that made it, but you don't necessarily have a face for any one of them. Whereas if you get a Morphogene or a Zero Coast, you probably think of my face. And people as human beings, I think, they like to feel like they're making a connection with another human being when they use a machine. I was teaching myself electronics when I was living in New York City at Brooklyn Public Library. They had books like that in the reference section. Books that were probably somewhat out of date for the time, but they were of interest because I wanted to learn specifically analog electronics. In a modular system, it's all analog. Whether it's the Morphogene or it's the DPO, it's still analog. Because at the end of the day, in order to communicate with you, you have to patch this voltage from here to there. You have to turn this knob. It does have, a digital signal processor in it, but it's an analog device. It receives analog signals and it outputs analog signals.
מה זו סינתזה של החוף המערבי לעומת סינתזה של החוף המזרחי? בחוף המזרחי היה רוברט מוג, שבעצם יצר סינתסייזרים למוזיקאים עם מקלדות שאפשר לנגן עליהם כל מוזיקה שרוצים. ואומנם האלבום הראשון שפרסם את הסינתסייזרים של בוב מוג היה Switched on Bach, שוונדי קרלוס יצרה, שזה בעצם היה לנגן את באך עם סינתסייזרים. לעומת זאת דון בוקלה, חלוץ הסינתסייזרים בחוף המערבי בסן פרנסיסקו, הוא העדיף סינתסייזרים ללא מקלדת. כי אם יש לנו כלי נגינה חדשים, בוא נעשה איתם גם מוזיקה חדשה ונתקשר איתם באינטרפייס מסוג חדש.
We flew into the Asheville airport and the newspaper for Asheville had Bob Moog's face on the cover. And of course got really excited. He says, oh my God, that's Bob Moog's on the front page of the paper here. And I walk up to the paper, sadly, it was to report his passing. I didn't even know that Moog Music was in Asheville. Kelly had suggested, hey, maybe you should call there and see if they're hiring. I called up, are you hiring? She says, I don't know, we might be. Can you get here like tomorrow or something? And I'm up in New York City thinking, what about Wednesday? So I called a quick flight down and interviewed them and took a job. I learned a lot working at Moog. Nobody at Moog was really interested in modular, and I was really interested in modular, and I'd bring my system in and try and show people, but it just wasn't really where they were at that time. Spending so much time with the Moog instruments and being able to really look at Dr. Moog's work closely, there was a point where I learned about Don Buchla, and so of course he became this exotic inventor that I didn't know so much about. This point where I'm kind of collecting photos, scouring the internet trying to find these things. And of course I hadn't ever played a Buchla at that point either. It wasn't until later that I met Alessandro Cortini, who let me play some of his instruments. He has a pretty great collection of Buchla instruments. I've always felt like that. Like you take what Don had done and don't just do the same thing. He would want you to do something, new. He'd probably want you to do something even newer than what we're doing, actually. He'd probably think it was silly that we were even doing analog. Yeah. When I launched the Maths module, some guys from New York invited me to a synth meet. It was literally in the guy's apartment. And they're like, hey, bring that new Maths module. Everyone wants to check it out. Everyone was 8 people. This is New York City. 8 people show up. In Chicago, the synth meets, we thought they were big when there'd be like 30 people there. The people who are drawn into modular, it's a very specific type of person, and you don't have to convince them. If you show them how it works, and you show them how it works well, and it's what they want, they will get it and they will use it. The other people that just are maybe buying it because they think it's something cool to do, a lot of them will probably not be interested for very long, I would imagine, because it's too much work. It doesn't do anything for you. You have to make it work. And so if it is a fashion, I think that will be very, very short-lived.
טוני רולנדו מדבר על שני סוגים של מוזיקאים שמצטרפים לסינתסייזרים המודולריים. אני רואה שלושה. יש את אלה שבאמת הצטרפו לזה בשנתיים-שלוש האחרונות, ומהר מאוד מגלים שזו עבודה קשה להגיע למשהו מעניין עם זה. יש את אלה שמשתמשים רק בסינתסייזרים מודולריים, הקאט של הסינתסייזרים המודולריים. הסוג השלישי הם אלה שנכנסו לזה חזק, עמוק, למדו את זה היטב, אבל צרפו את זה לתוך מערכת העשייה המוזיקלית הרגילה שלהם. אני אחד מהם. הסינתסייזרים המודולריים חיים אצלי בשלום יחד עם הגיטרות שלי ויחד עם הנגנים שאני מנגן איתם ועושה איתם מוזיקה. איך אתם משלבים? הגיבו לוידאו הזה, ובכלל אשמח לשמוע מכם.